The Handley Page. Hastings lurched in the pre-dawn turbulence over the Mediterranean, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Crook felt the familiar tightening across his shoulders as the dispatcher held up 4 fingers. 4 minutes to the drop. Below him, somewhere in the darkness, scudding past at 700 feet, lay a strip of sand on the Egyptian coast called El Gamil, a name that, until a fortnight earlier, had meant nothing to any soldier in the British Army. Behind Crook, in a chain of 18 transports threading out of Cyprus through the chill November dawn, sat 660 men of the 3rd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. Many had not jumped operationally in their lives. Some had not jumped in months. The aircraft they rode in were not designed for paratroopers at all. They were converted Hastings and aging Valettas, their cabins too narrow, their doors too small, their interiors smelling of aviation fuel and apprehension. The Royal Air Force had cobbled together an airborne assault on a fortnight's notice, with equipment hauled from mothballed stores in a panic. The red light came on. The men stood, hooked up, checked equipment. Outside, the Egyptian coast slid beneath the wings. Palm trees, a railway line, the white scar of the airfield itself, and beyond it, the dark blue glitter of Lake Manzala. Tracer began to climb lazily towards them, slow at first, then ferocious. Crook glanced down through the open door and saw the muzzle flashes of Su-100 self-propelled guns dug in along the perimeter. The green light. He went. What followed in the next 47 minutes would become one of the most extraordinary feats of arms in the post-war history of the British Army. A textbook airborne seizure executed against entrenched opposition by men who had been told their war was over a decade before. It would be the last operational parachute assault the British military has ever conducted. And yet, and here lies the tragedy that haunts every survivor's memoir, it would also be utterly, comprehensively pointless. Within 72 hours of the green light glowing in Crook's aircraft, the Prime Minister of Great Britain would be on the floor of the House of Commons announcing a ceasefire. Within a fortnight, the Chancellor of the Exchequer would be begging Washington for a loan to save sterling. Within 2 months, Anthony Eden would resign in disgrace. How did it come to this? How did 660 British paratroopers find themselves dropping into the teeth of Egyptian fire to seize an airfield that Whitehall would abandon almost before the dust had settled? How did the finest expeditionary force in NATO outside the United States execute a flawless tactical operation in the service of a strategic catastrophe so profound that it ended Britain's pretensions to independent great power status forever? The answer involves a secret meeting in a French villa, a forged casus belli, a prime minister hooked on Benzedrine and ailing from a botched gallbladder operation, and a furious American president who picked up the telephone and brought the pound to its knees. It involves the Foreign Office in revolt, the chiefs of staff dissenting in private, the Israelis playing both ends against the middle, and a Soviet leader threatening to rain rockets on London while his tanks crushed Hungary. But before any of that, before the high diplomacy and the low intrigue, there are 660 men descending under canopy into a wall of tracer over an Egyptian airfield. Let us begin with them, because what they did at El Gamil deserves to be remembered, even if the war they fought in does not. To understand why British paratroopers were jumping into Egypt in November 1956, one must first understand the peculiar exhaustion that had settled over the country in the years following its supposed victory in the Second World War. Britain, in 1956, was, by any honest accounting, broke. Rationing had only ended 2 years earlier. The post-war American loan had bled away faster than the Treasury had projected. The empire was unraveling. India, and Pakistan had gone in 1947, Burma in 1948, Palestine had been handed off to the United Nations, and the consequences had not been pretty. Whitehall still spoke the language of global power, still maintained garrisons from Hong Kong to Aden to Cyprus, still operated the largest navy west of the Atlantic, still flew valiant bombers carrying a brand new atomic deterrent. But the foundations were rotten. The pound was permanently weak. The current account drifted in and out of deficit. And the political class still could not quite reconcile itself to the truth that Britain was no longer a first-class power. Into this brittle confidence stepped Anthony Eden, who had succeeded Winston Churchill in number 10 in April 1955. Eden was a complicated figure. He had been the golden boy of British foreign policy for 2 decades. The man who resigned from Neville Chamberlain's cabinet over appeasement. The dashing foreign secretary at Yalta and Potsdam. The heir presumptive who had waited and waited for Churchill to step aside. By the time he finally got the job he had spent his life pursuing, he was approaching 60, exhausted, and gravely ill. A surgical accident in 1953 had damaged his bile duct and left him in chronic pain, dependent on amphetamines and barbiturates that wrought havoc on his judgment. The Foreign Office, meanwhile, was haunted by a particular ghost, the ghost of Munich. The generation of diplomats and politicians who had watched appeasement fail in the 1930s had sworn never again to allow a continental dictator to bully Britain into retreat. When, on July 26, 1956, a stocky Egyptian colonel named Gamil Abdel Nasser climbed onto a podium in Alexandria and announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal Company, Eden and his circle saw not a third world nationalist but a new Hitler in khaki. The canal mattered to Britain in a way that is now difficult to convey. 2/3 of Western Europe's oil passed through it. A quarter of all British imports came that way. The Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet depended on it. The Canal Zone garrison had only been evacuated in 1954, after a tortuous diplomatic process that the right wing of the Conservative Party, the so-called Suez Group, had bitterly opposed. To lose the canal to an Egyptian strongman who had been arming himself with Soviet weapons through a Czech arms deal was, in Eden's view, intolerable. The War Cabinet met in emergency session. The chiefs of staff were instructed to draw up contingencies for military intervention. The Foreign Office began discreet conversations in Paris, where the French government, itself entangled in a brutal counterinsurgency in Algeria that it blamed Nasser for fueling, was incandescent. The Joint Intelligence Committee assessed Egyptian capabilities and reported accurately that Nasser's army was no match for British and French regulars. Public opinion, fed by a press that took its lead from a furious number 10, swung sharply behind action. But there was a problem. Eisenhower's administration in Washington, in an election year, courting the votes of newly independent nations, terrified of pushing the Arab world into Soviet arms, would not countenance the use of force. And without American acquiescence, no major British military operation could survive the financial pressure that would follow. Eden knew this. He chose to proceed anyway. And that decision would require deception on a scale unprecedented in post-war British politics. The scheme that emerged from late-night meetings in Number 10, the Quai d'Orsay, and a private villa at Sèvres in the suburbs of Paris was, by any standard, extraordinary. France would coordinate with Israel, whose Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion had his own quarrel with Nasser and his own interest in opening the Straits of Tiran. Israel would invade the Sinai. Britain and France would then issue an ultimatum demanding that both belligerents withdraw from the canal knowing perfectly well that Egypt could not accept such terms. When Egypt refused, Anglo-French forces would intervene to separate the combatants and conveniently occupy the waterway. The Sèvres Protocol, signed on October 24, 1956, by representatives of the three governments, was perhaps the most cynical document a British Foreign Secretary had ever put his name to. Selwyn Lloyd, who attended reluctantly and disliked the whole business intensely, signed nonetheless. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, was enthusiastically on board. He would be remembered for the phrase, first in, first out, once the financial consequences struck, but in October 1956 he was the Cabinet's principal hawk. Only a handful of senior civil servants knew the full picture. The chiefs of staff received operational orders without being told about the collusion. Sir Walter Monckton, Minister of Defence, and a friend of Eden's since their days at Christchurch, opposed the operation so strongly that he was quietly moved sideways before the assault began. The military instrument selected for the seizure of the Canal Zone was assembled under General Sir Charles Cately, Commander-in-Chief Allied Forces, with Air Marshal Dennis Barnett commanding the air component and Vice Admiral Manly Power leading the naval task force. The plan, codenamed Operation Musketeer, went through several iterations, beginning as a Normandy-style amphibious landing at Alexandria. Then, after political objections to the optics of bombarding Egyptian cities, evolving into a more focused assault on Port Said at the canal's northern entrance. At the sharp end of the operation stood the 16th Independent Parachute Brigade, commanded by Brigadier M. A. H. Tubby Butler. The brigade comprised the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Battalions of the Parachute Regiment. To the 3rd Battalion, 3 Para, fell the mission that would write itself into regimental history. A battalion-strength airborne drop on the El Gamil Airfield, a slim coastal strip of sand and concrete west of Port Said. Once secured, the airfield would serve as a forward operating base from which the rest of the assault could be supported and casualties evacuated. The man chosen to lead the drop was Lieutenant Colonel Paul Crook, a tough, professional infantryman who had taken command of 3 Para earlier that year. Crook understood, better than most, what could go wrong when paratroopers met determined opposition over open ground. He had absorbed the lessons of Arnhem at second hand in the long staff colleges of the post-war years, and he was determined his battalion would not repeat them. His men were flown to RAF Nicosia in Cyprus through the second half of October. Conditions were primitive. The battalion slept in tents on a stony hillside. Equipment had to be reissued from disused stores. Some of the parachutes themselves had been packed years before and had to be rechecked one canopy at a time. Aircraft were a particular problem. The standard British transport, the Hastings, had a narrow doorway that made it awkward for a fully equipped paratrooper to exit cleanly. There were too few of them, and they were too slow. While 3 PARA rehearsed on the dry hills above Nicosia, the French 2 Régiment Parachutiste Colonial, battle-hardened from Indochina and Algeria, prepared for their own jump on Port Fouad, on the eastern bank of the canal. The 2 airborne assaults would go in within an hour of each other on the morning of November 5th. By then, however, the political ground beneath the operation had already begun to tremble. On the evening of October 29th, 1956, Israeli paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel Raphael Eitan dropped at the Mitla Pass, deep in the Sinai. The Israeli ground offensive surged behind them. Within 48 hours, the Egyptian Sinai garrison was reeling, Israeli armor was driving westward toward the canal, and the Anglo-French ultimatum had been duly delivered to both Cairo and Tel Aviv. NASA, predictably, refused. Eden rose in the Commons to announce that, in the interests of safeguarding international shipping, Her Majesty's government would now take such measures as were necessary. The reaction at Westminster was incandescent. Hugh Gaitskell, leader of the Labour opposition, having initially indicated cautious sympathy, swung into furious denunciation once collusion began to be suspected. The Foreign Office, where senior officials had been bypassed entirely during the Sèvres negotiations, was in something close to open mutiny. Sir William Hayter, the British ambassador to Moscow, telegraphed warnings of catastrophic damage to Britain's standing. Sir Pearson Dixon, the permanent representative at the United Nations, found himself instructed to oppose a resolution he privately believed to be both lawful and necessary. Two ministers resigned: Sir Edward Boyle, Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and Anthony Nutting, Minister of State at the Foreign Office. Nutting's letter to Eden was a quiet act of devastating conscience. He had been deeply involved in the planning, knew exactly what the government had done, and could not bring himself to defend it publicly. The cabinet held. The country, however, did not. Demonstrations filled Trafalgar Square. Aneurin Bevan thundered from the platform that the government had been guilty of criminal folly. The press divided savagely along factional lines, with the Times and the Daily Telegraph backing the government, and the Observer, the Manchester Guardian, and the Mirror eviscerating it. In Cyprus, the men of Three Para followed the news through the BBC World Service, crackling on company radios. They were professionals. Politics was above their pay grade, but the volatility was unsettling. Several times the operation was put back as Whitehall haggled over the timing. The decision to commit had been made, but when, and in what configuration, kept shifting. Then, on October 31st, the RAF struck. Canberra and Valiant bombers from Cyprus and Malta hit Egyptian airfields in a campaign designed to wipe out NASA's small but growing fleet of MiG-15S and Il-28S before the ground assault began. For 5 days, British and French aircraft pounded targets across the Nile Delta. The Egyptian Air Force, much of it caught on the ground, was largely destroyed. Strategic surprise was lost, but air supremacy was won. The original Musketeer plan had envisaged the airborne assault going in only once the amphibious task force steaming from Malta had arrived off Port Said. But the politics would not wait. Every day of bombing without ground action increased the diplomatic pressure on London and Paris. Eisenhower was on the telephone to Eden. The United Nations General Assembly, in emergency session, was preparing resolutions condemning the intervention. The Soviet Union, emboldened paradoxically by the simultaneous Western embarrassment and by its own brutal suppression of the Hungarian uprising, was issuing threats of rocket attacks on London and Paris. A decision was taken to bring the airborne drop forward. Rather than wait for the Naval Task Force, Three Para and the two ERPC would go in alone on November 5th, seizing the bridgeheads. The amphibious follow-up would arrive on November 6th. This was a substantial gamble. If the paratroopers met heavier resistance than expected, or if the link-up was delayed, they could be cut off and overrun. Brigadier Butler accepted the risk. Crook accepted the risk. The men were told to be ready to enplane in the small hours of the morning. That night, in Nicosia, very few of them slept. At 4:45 on the morning of November 5th, 1956, the first of 18 Hastings and Valletta transports rolled down the runway at RAF Nicosia. The dawn was cold and clear. In the cabins, the men of Three Para sat strapped to their bench seats, faces blackened, equipment slung beneath their reserves. Crook flew in the lead aircraft of A Company, which would drop first. The flight took 2.5 hours. As the coast of Egypt came into view, the formation descended to 700 feet, low enough to give the parachutes minimal time to deploy, but also low enough to limit the descent under fire. Below, El Gamil Airfield revealed itself exactly as the briefing photographs had shown. A single concrete runway running east to west, parallel to the sea, with a cluster of low buildings at the western end and a sewage farm and Muslim cemetery to the south. Beyond the perimeter, dug into the sand and palm groves, lay the Egyptian defenders, elements of the Egyptian National Guard and regular infantry supported by Su-100 assault guns, anti-aircraft positions, and a handful of MiG-15S on satellite strips that the RAF had not entirely silenced. The green light snapped on at 07:15 hours local time. Crook went first. Behind him, in 2 long sticks per aircraft, 660 British paratroopers tumbled into the Egyptian sky. The descent took 30 seconds. Tracer climbed past them in lazy red arcs. Several men were hit in the canopy. One, Lance Corporal Edwards, was killed before he reached the ground. Bundles of heavy equipment swung beneath their parachutes. A vehicle pannier broke loose and crashed into the sewage farm, scattering its contents. The drop zone was small and tight, hemmed in by the sea to the north and the cemetery to the south. Most of the battalion landed within the airfield perimeter itself, a tribute both to the RAF's precision and to the brigade's relentless rehearsal in the Cyprus Hills. Within 7 minutes, the first rallying points were established. Crook set up his tactical headquarters near the control tower. A company swept westward toward the buildings. B Company cleared the runway and pushed south toward the cemetery. C Company secured the eastern perimeter against any Egyptian counterattack from Port Said. The fighting was brisk, close, and decisive. In the control tower, paratroopers cleared room by room with grenades and Sten guns. At the cemetery, B Company met determined resistance from dug-in infantry supported by an Su-100. The assault gun was knocked out at close range with a 3.5-inch rocket launcher. Along the southern perimeter, the men of C Company traded fire across the marshy ground of the sewage farm, taking the heaviest casualties of the morning. A platoon commander was killed leading an assault on a machine gun nest. The battalion's chaplain moved among the wounded under fire and would later be mentioned in dispatches. By 08:02 hours, 47 minutes after the green light, the airfield was in British hands. The Egyptian defenders had either been killed, taken prisoner, or had melted away into Port Said. The runway was cleared, the buildings were secure, and ground signals were being laid out for the follow-on Beverley transports to bring in jeeps, anti-tank guns, and ammunition. Within 2 hours, helicopters of the Royal Navy's 845 Squadron, flying off the carriers Theseus and Ocean, were landing wounded and lifting in reinforcements. It was the first helicopter assault in British military history. By midday, surviving Egyptian MiGs attempted a single attack on the airfield. They were driven off by Seahawks and Sea Venoms from the fleet. By nightfall, the eastern half of Port Said was under Anglo-French control. Tactically, El Gamil had been a triumph. Strategically, the catastrophe was only beginning. The butcher's bill at El Gamil was, by the standards of post-war British operations, mercifully light. 4 members of 3 para were killed in the drop and the ensuing fight. Around 30 were wounded, several seriously. Egyptian losses were heavier, perhaps 30 to 40 dead, a similar number wounded, and over 70 taken prisoner. Across the wider operation in and around Port Said, total British casualties amounted to 16 killed and 96 wounded. The French lost 10 dead and 33 wounded. Egyptian military and civilian casualties have never been precisely established, but ran into the hundreds and possibly the low thousands, with much of the destruction concentrated in the slums of Port Said, where naval gunfire and street fighting had been heaviest. But the real cost of Suez was not counted in bodies. It was counted in pounds sterling, in political careers, in the corroded credibility of British power. The financial run on sterling began almost the moment the first bombs fell. Speculators dumped pounds. The Bank of England's gold reserves, already thin, hemorrhaged. Macmillan, at the Treasury, watched the figures come in and underwent what the historian Alastair Horn would later describe as a transformation more dramatic than that of Saul on the road to Damascus. By November 6th, he was telling the cabinet that without an emergency loan from the International Monetary Fund, sterling could not survive the month. The IMF was, in effect, controlled by the United States Treasury. And the United States Treasury, on direct instruction from a furious President Eisenhower, refused to release any funds until Britain agreed to an unconditional ceasefire. Eisenhower was beyond persuasion. He had not been consulted. He had been lied to about the collusion. He was contesting a presidential election on a peace platform. And he was watching, with mounting horror, as Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest while America's principal allies handed Moscow a propaganda gift of incalculable value. When Eden telephoned the White House, Eisenhower refused to take the call. The message was relayed through John Foster Dulles, ailing in hospital, and through the British ambassador in Washington, Sir Roger Markins. The assault would stop, or the pound would fall. Eden, broken in body and increasingly in mind, capitulated. On the evening of November 6th, 23 hours after the amphibious assault on Port Said had begun, and with British troops already advancing southwards down the canal road towards Suez City, the Prime Minister announced a ceasefire to a stunned House of Commons. The French, who had been prepared to fight on alone, were betrayed by the suddenness of the British decision. Guy Mollet's government would survive only a few months longer. Anglo-French confidence in one another, painstakingly rebuilt since 1940, was shattered for a generation. In Whitehall, the post-mortem began at once. The Joint Intelligence Committee had to explain how it had failed to warn the government that the Americans would actively oppose, not merely disapprove of, the operation. The Foreign Office had to explain how a cabinet decision based on collusion had been allowed to proceed without proper warning of the diplomatic consequences. The Treasury had to explain how the country had been allowed to embark on a major war with reserves insufficient to weather a single week of speculative pressure. What Britain learned at El Gamil was something it had begun to suspect since 1947, but had refused to face squarely: that the United Kingdom could no longer act as an independent great power against the active opposition of the United States. The empire that had defied Napoleon and the Kaiser and Hitler could not now defy Eisenhower. The implications of that lesson would shape British foreign policy for the next half-century, and arguably continue to do so today. Eden survived the immediate political crisis by a matter of weeks, and survived it only just. He flew to Jamaica in late November, ostensibly to convalesce at Ian Fleming's house at Goldeneye. In reality, to escape a cabinet and parliament from which he could no longer command confidence. He returned in mid-December, sallow and trembling, to address a Commons that had ceased to believe him. On December 20th, 1956, asked directly whether there had been foreknowledge of the Israeli attack, he told the House there had not. It was a falsehood, and one for which his reputation never recovered. On January 9th, 1957, Eden resigned. The Queen, advised by Lord Salisbury and Lord Kilmore, who polled the cabinet by asking each minister whether he preferred Wobb or Howald, Rab Butler or Harold Macmillan, chose Macmillan, the architect of the financial panic that had brought the operation down. There was a brutal irony to the choice. The man who had been first in, first out, emerged as Prime Minister, charged with rebuilding the relationship with Washington that his own volte-face had helped to fracture. Macmillan's repair work began almost immediately. By March 1957, he was at Bermuda with Eisenhower, beginning the careful reconstruction of what would become known as the special relationship in its post-Suez form. A relationship in which Britain accepted, more or less explicitly, that its global role would henceforth be exercised in partnership with and under the broad strategic umbrella of the United States. The era of independent action was over. When Britain next went to war east of Suez, in Aden, in Borneo, in the Persian Gulf, it would do so within carefully negotiated limits and with Washington's prior acquiescence. The wider strategic consequences cascaded outward. Duncan Sandys, Macmillan's defense minister, used the post-Suez climate to push through the radical defense white paper of 1957, which slashed conventional forces, scrapped most manned aircraft procurement in favor of missiles, and accelerated Britain's reliance on nuclear deterrence. The conscript army of national service was wound down. The empire began its terminal retreat. Ghana gained independence in March 1957, Malaya in August, and the wind of change that Macmillan would describe in Cape Town 3 years later was, in truth, the wind of Suez. In the Middle East, Nasser emerged as the great victor. Defeated militarily, he had won politically and diplomatically on a scale no Arab leader had achieved in a century. His prestige soared from Morocco to Yemen. The brief union with Syria, the rise of pan-Arab nationalism, the long shadow over Israel that would culminate in the catastrophe of 1967. All of it had its roots in the humiliation that Eden's misadventure had inflicted upon British power and upon the British position in the Arab world. For the parachute regiment itself, El Gamil entered the regimental history alongside Bruneval and Arnhem and the Rhine crossings. A small jewel in the cap badge, a vindication of professionalism amid a wider political shambles. The lessons learned at Port Said, particularly the use of helicopters for vertical envelopment, would feed directly into the doctrine of 3 Commando Brigade and would shape British amphibious thinking for decades. The Royal Marines assault that morning, with 845 Naval Air Squadron lifting Marines directly from HMS Theseus into Port Said, was studied in Pentagon staff colleges as the prototype of an entirely new form of warfare. And yet, none of these professional vindications could disguise the underlying reality. Britain had attempted to behave as a great power, and had been forced to behave as a client. The mask had slipped, and behind it, the world had glimpsed the truth that Whitehall had been trying for a decade to conceal even from itself. Almost 70 years on, the 47 minutes that Paul Crook and his men spent seizing El Gamil Airfield retain a peculiar, dual character. Military triumph contained within strategic disaster, professional excellence in the service of political folly. To study Suez is to confront an awkward set of questions about what Britain was, what Britain had become, and what Britain could honestly do in the world. The parachute regiment has not made an operational drop since. Every subsequent British military intervention, the Falklands, the Gulf, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan, has used parachutists, but never as a tactical instrument in the way they were used at El Gamil and at Port Fouad. The art of the battalion-strength airborne assault, perfected at such cost over Normandy and at Arnhem and across the Rhine, was buried in the sands west of Port Said. Helicopter assault, pioneered that same morning by the Royal Marines off Theseus and Ocean, was the future. The paratroopers' role would henceforth be that of elite light infantry. Magnificent, but no longer the spearhead of vertical envelopment. The political legacy ran deeper still. Suez taught the British political class 3 lessons that have shaped policy ever since. The first was that no major military operation could be undertaken in defiance of the United States. The second was that the sterling area and Britain's wider economic position was too fragile to withstand sustained American pressure. The third, and this lesson took longer to absorb, was that Britain's future role might lie not in the global imperial vocation, but in something closer and more modest. A leading power within a European framework, anchored to Washington but capable of independent diplomatic initiative within carefully understood limits. Some historians argue that Suez accelerated decolonization by a decade. Others suggest it merely accelerated what was inevitable. What is beyond serious dispute is that the events of November 1956 marked, with unusual clarity, the moment at which Britain ceased to be the kind of country that had built the empire and became the kind of country that had to live with the empire's consequences. The transition was painful, frequently graceless, and is in some respects still being worked through today. For the men of Three Para, the meaning was simpler. They had done what they had been asked to do, swiftly and professionally, against an enemy who fought harder than the briefings had predicted, in pursuit of objectives that their government would abandon before the gunpowder had cooled. Most went on with their soldiering, to Cyprus, to Aden, to Borneo, to Northern Ireland in time. Some left the army and rarely spoke of those 47 minutes again. A few wrote memoirs. Paul Crook himself rose to the rank of Major General. The battalion's dead lie buried in the British military cemetery at Wayne's Keep on Cyprus. When you next walk past the cenotaph in Whitehall on Remembrance Sunday and see the regimental banners of the parachute regiment dipping in salute, spare a thought for El Gamil. It was not the most famous British operation of the 20th century. It was not the largest, nor the most consequential. But in its compressed 47 minutes, it contained, in miniature, the whole tangled story of post-imperial Britain. The courage, the professionalism, the cynicism of the politicians, the indifference of allies, the cost paid by men who asked no questions and got no answers. What do you think of how Eden and his cabinet handled the Suez Crisis? A justified defense of British interests, or the last gasp of imperial delusion? Drop your view in the comments below. Give the video a like if you've made it this far, and subscribe for more deep dives into Britain's forgotten wars. Until next time.